Without Deluxe, Transport Tycoon for me would just be another well-regarded 1990s management game. One that, I ultimately grew tired of and eventually forgot. And that's a provocative statement, right? But with this game and this very box, now 30 years old, I think it's time to look at how the seemingly small refinements of Transport Tycoon Deluxe transformed the game into something I found endlessly replayable. And if I'd known I'd still be playing it 3 decades later, I might have taken this box back to the shop and got one that's the same language on both sides. God, is that a rare production defect that makes this worth thousands? No, let's forget I ever said that. Let's just pop that back on the shelf and then rewind. Fine. Instead, let's have a little history. Microprose had been quick to capitalise on the popularity of Transport Tycoon, with a world editor add-on arriving only a few months after the first game hit shelves. And that didn't add a huge amount, unless you were very, very keen on painstakingly recreating your own local area, although it does have a Martian graphics reskin, which is unique to that version, as is the ability to switch between regular graphics and Martian graphics mid-game. Deluxe, once you've chosen a climate, you're stuck with it. Even as I was looking at the world editor in the Woking branch of Game early in 1995, magazines were suggesting that Microprose would be releasing Transport Tycoon 2 later in the year. And that may seem a bit swift even by 90s game release timelines, but XCOM fans of the period will be familiar with Microprose's aggressive sequel strategy around this time, with Terror from the Deep the only thing the Gollops believed was possible in the mere 6 months available for development. Get another team at Microprose to put together a reskin of the game with no significant engine changes, just make it look like a new game, while they worked on actual new game, Apocalypse. What we didn't know at the time was the 1993 merger with Spectrum Holobyte had not gone well for Microprose. It was supposed to be the perfect marriage, a company with money but not many game ideas, and a company with many game ideas but not money. But by 1995, the unified company was suffering from cash flow problems. All those re-releases, those gold versions, those expansion packs which barely expand anything, they were the first symptoms of a company desperately trying to get enough money in the bank to survive, and in 1996 the truly aggressive cost-cutting and studio closures would begin. A short timescale in a publisher with not much money wasn't the only problem that Chris Sawyer had to contend with for a sequel. See, in his view, Transport Tycoon was it was done. And there's a few ideas which had inevitably been cut to make the 1994 release date of the original, and you could put those back in, but short of writing a new engine which would require more time than was available and more powerful hardware than most people had at the time, they were probably still using the same PC they were using for Transport Tycoon, there wasn't anything he felt that was particularly lacking in his vision of the perfect transport game for the 486. And, as we know, once he came to write that more advanced game engine, he quickly got bored of transport and became fascinated by roller coasters instead. So the follow-up became Transport Tycoon Deluxe, and the mission was simple. Add enough gameplay options and features to make it a compelling upgrade for owners of the original, but don't mess too much with what are, after all, sound gameplay mechanics. Having not managed to save up enough pocket money to buy the world editor, the immediate attraction for me was that Deluxe would include a scenario editor from the get-go, along with 3 new biomes to explore. Okay, I didn't know at the time one of them was Toyland. A copy was duly requested from a parent for Christmas 1995, and look, I held that thing up a few minutes ago. It's pretty clear this story is not. However, I never did get that copy of Transport Tycoon Deluxe, and that's why my favourite game of all time is Warcraft 2. No, but my favourite game of all time is not Warcraft 2. I played it, but I didn't even own it. In fact, having made that bold statement about what is my favourite by way of implication, I was actually pretty disappointed by that game over the holiday. First off, when you load it up, the terrain appears muted compared to the bright and colourful environment of Transport Tycoon. Farms, rather than being neat little rectangles, rudely spread their fields all over the place. It costs far too much to build over them. The realistic vehicle names of the first outing's original UK release have been lawyered and replaced with these stupid ones named after game testers. You bet I changed that the moment I found the custom names feature. A new thing, new for Deluxe. Instead of playing through the golden age of Steam from the 1930s, you started in 1950. And that's barely time to set up a couple of routes before diesel engines are rumbling out of your depots and jet aviation is the norm. Investigation of those new climates reveals they offer a rather limited selection of engines, with too many similar vehicles introduced in the first few years and then just nothing between 1977's Turner Turbo and the invention of the monorail in 2001. Even if you're ignoring the trains in favour of road vehicles, there's a minor annoyance here, and the second generation dropping from a robust 70 miles per hour in Transport Tycoon to a mere 55 miles per hour in Deluxe, making them much less competitive with other transport methods. Yes, of course. Now, I know that the maximum speed of a road vehicle in the original engine was 79 miles per hour, and this reduction was to make room for a third generation of road vehicles to still be usefully faster than what you already had, but it was still annoying. Suffice to say, all of these things, I was very wrong about Transport Tycoon Deluxe. And all the things I was wrong about, the thing I was most wrong about was signals. My belief circa late December 1995 was that Chris Sawyer had taken something which was very simple. You put a signal on a track and it stops the trains crashing into each other. And he'd made it complicated with all this extra detail about one-way signals and all the many ways they can make trains get lost, be unable to get out of a station they'd just driven into, and ultimately crash into each other as I tried to fix it in production. Yeah, I didn't understand what was going on, only that if you clicked on signals more than once, things went a bit weird. But if I wasn't of an age to understand these things instantly, I was of an age where I had an entire school holiday to get through, and since we had invented neither doom scrolling nor Steam backlogs in 1995, about the best option I had was to try to wrest some entertainment out of the latest game. So I found myself delving through the built-in scenarios, another new feature for Deluxe. Many of these were maps in silly shapes with gimmicks such as the ability to accidentally flood an entire area by lowering the wrong tile, or they were full of signposts and town names detailing Microprose in-jokes. Yeah, the QA team had a lot of fun with some of these, and I do love this about this era of Microprose game. How much stuff was put in by the testers when it came to the in-game scenarios and saves. And a couple of those were save games in progress. Scotland 1956 was impressive as what I believed was a model of a real-world railway network at the time, but it was difficult terrain to build in, and you were starting at a big disadvantage, not having anything built, while also having already burnt for about 25k of loan, just idling for 6 years. So that didn't hold my attention for long. What did was a scenario about halfway through the subtropical selection. Megarail 1960. Megarail blew my tiny little mind. It's laughably simplistic by modern network building standards, full of junctions and ideas which would have you laughed off the OpenTDD subreddit, but this was 1995. We were still a few years off the great age of roundabouts, or indeed in the online discussion of junction design for all but a lucky few with a modem. Your sum total of things you'd seen built in Transport Tycoon were things you or the people around you had built, and unless one of those people was a network design genius, then you'd probably never seen more than 2 trains share the same track without deadlocking. And since the sum total of people I knew who played Transport Tycoon at this point were me and my younger stepsister, I had not seen an impressive network built. And maybe I should have tried the family dog. You know, those border collies are pretty intelligent. And that's a plus for greyhound ownership. Far less risk of being outsmarted by your own pet. But I wouldn't say it's impossible, there's just less risk of it. The big attraction of Megarail for me was less the complexity of the network, but the fact you were being given a functioning, profitable company. I was not good at Transport Tycoon in 1995. And some people would say I'm not good at it now, there's video evidence of that. But I'd only managed to see a game through to completion once, and given I thought during that game having 300,000 in the company accounts was impressive even after inflation, I'm not sure that I was much further from bankruptcy than I was with most of my failed companies. Megarail more or less played itself. You could experiment with all sorts of things, and provided you didn't deadlock the main network, which was a disaster, it would keep making money, letting you pay down the loan and eventually buy up all those AI companies. The real genius, though, was that eventually you'd be tempted into connecting something to that existing network, or it would deadlock of its own accord and you'd have to go and fix it. And sure, as a not very good player, I also enjoyed loading up West Country 90210, or is it 90201? I think the TV series is correct and the scenario is wrong, and setting bus and lorry routes going over all those pre-built motorways. I definitely took more than one of those games into the 2000s, discovering along the way that some of the third generation vehicles were bugged and would swap between streamlined and non-streamlined appearances depending on if they had a full load of cargo or not. Yeah, that's the kind of thing that I noticed even as a teenager. But I couldn't escape the feeling that, easy as this building up a road network and complaining about vehicle appearances was, it wasn't as fun as tweaking Megarail. So I patiently watched the endgame tutorials, then looked back at Megarail to see how those concepts applied on a complete network. In the process, those one-way signals went from a bewildering array of ways to make my trains deadlock, to a logical and obvious way to have dozens of them beetling about on the same tracks. I became addicted to creating the one network to rule them all, everything on the map connected to everything else. Now, with Transport Tycoon's primitive route finder designed to run an acceptable time in a low-end 486, I also became well used to building escape tracks and loops to force trains to go to the right place. Realistic prototypical operation, this is not. And the odd thing here is, after a couple of years of happy tycooning in deluxe fashion, I thought, let's go back to Transport Tycoon with its prettier hills and better company colours to try the same. There was a save game I called Trans 94, and it didn't work. And that's been the case ever since. I've never found myself getting more than a few years in before finding that original game too limiting or dragging a little with its slow pace. Yeah, I felt like I could get a company up and running and grow it because I finally knew how to play the game, but I never had that feeling I could start from a tiny train route and grow it into a map-spanning network full of complex and clever hacks to keep it working. You know, even in my 30-year retrospective video, as someone who's played this game for decades, I only got a few years in, and a lot of the points I made ended up being universal ones, which apply to Deluxe just as much as they do the original. So, what is it? What makes Deluxe work so well, despite being essentially the same game? Well, you know, one-way signals, a scenario showing you how to use them. That's the whole story I just told. But no, it's more than that. If Terror from the Deep is the approach of creating a sequel in a very short space of time by doing as little as possible to the engine while creating an entirely new game, then Transport Tycoon is the opposite. It is exactly the same game. It uses the same assets in so many places, but also with as many quality of life improvements as could possibly be crammed in. And the only thing I still think's a bit of a misstep is losing the fun of playing through the 1930s and waiting for air travel to become viable. And yeah, I know, with only 256 vehicle ideas to play with, every single one of those IDs is used, compromises have to be taken somewhere. But I think with either only loading the relevant vehicles for a climate or, yeah, I'm going to go here, dropping Toyland's pathetic vehicle roster, there could have been scope for a more deluxe game time span, playing 125 years from 1925 to 2050, especially with the much faster game clock in Deluxe. But you know, I would say that I've made not one but two vehicle sets where you can start with multiple types of horses. Who needs 1925 when you've got 1725? Alright, maybe a bit less about my tendency to build a voxel editor with malicious intent, and back to Transport Tycoon Deluxe. All those little improvements make it so much less frustrating to play in modern times than many of its peers, and indeed its direct predecessor. I always notice when I go back to OG Transport Tycoon how much clickier it is than Deluxe. Even though, in theory, there's not much difference in the interfaces beyond how the buttons are laid out, everything feels like just more work to get done. And I know in these days, OpenTTD has taken quality of life to an entirely different level, but we managed to survive a lot of years on good old Deluxe and TTD patch, and I think a part of that is just how good this user interface is for 1995. And really it gives you the perfect combination. You can build more complicated and interesting things thanks to that seemingly minor change of adding one-way signals, while the interface makes doing so and managing it easier. Deluxe introduces so many just small things which just feel natural, Whether it's being able to refit your ships and aircraft to carry different cargo, or being able to fund your own industries once you're rich enough to decide that you're going to have a production complex here. More than just being quality of life changes though, these all add up to a game with much more depth than the original. Especially when that original version is the one without the scenario editor. There's only one real path through Transport Tycoon. You're going to get the same kind of randomly generated map with the same industries. Rail is always going to be the best way to make money in the early game. You can only ever make point-to-point routes because the signalling's not good enough for anything else. You know, it's a good game, but you don't have to play through it that many times to have done everything it's possible to do there. Open up Deluxe and now you've got options. There are the obvious new climates where you need to deliver food to towns to make them grow. But how do you want to do that? Going to aircraft right from the start is viable. With the scenario editor, you could easily start a game in the 1970s with access to decent road vehicles. Ships will carry anything in this version, so you could put together a watery map where everything moves by river and sea. If you like a lot of micromanaging boys, because the pathfinding in the original games is, yeah, it's that for ships as well. Although, I do get to say boy, which is always fun because it's one of those words which comes up rarely enough in everyday conversation that people don't realise there are different pronunciations between British and American English. Yeah, let the using a stupid AI voice, it sounds stupid, you can't even be bothered to fix the way it says buoy comments begin. No, don't let them begin, they're actually really quite tedious. For me, this extra depth is why I spent so much more time playing Deluxe, even before TTD patch came along. It always felt like there was something new to try. A subtropical map with 2 giant cities at the corners and a series of tiny desert towns in between. Arctic mountains with a town on each peak and industries in the valleys. Trying to make your own local area in the temperate climate, assuming your local area was in a temperate climate. Toyland. Well, there was always a brief bit of fun in consciously ignoring it. Oh, alright, fine. This was long before Toyland became a meme, and I did attempt to play it a couple of times. Although, even without the rest of the internet egging me on to make jokes about it, the limited vehicle selection and somewhat visually busy aesthetic usually got to me pretty quickly. And when I went back to Transport Tycoon for that 30-year retrospective, I found myself talking a lot about flaws, but also a lot about charm. And if there's one criticism I can keep from my initial bouncing off Deluxe, it's that with the more muted tones and the more efficient user interface, some of that charm is lost along with the jankiness. But it's a small price to pay for a huge increase in depth. This one doesn't feel 30 years old in the same way to me. And some of that is because even now I still catch myself going into it to capture some bit of footage or, check something. Was that there in OpenTTD or the original? And suddenly I realise I've been playing the game properly for an hour without thinking about it. And yes, sometimes I will be caught out by something that I've forgotten was a TTD patch or OpenTTD feature. Building on Foundations is one of those, but those extra few months of polish and refinement make a disproportionately huge difference. Going back 30 years from the current state of OpenTTD is way less painful than going back the extra one from Deluxe to non-Deluxe. Although, maybe that is just me. I had an early version of this script, and it made a much more boldly provocative statement about the difference between the two games. But as I played them and thought more about my reaction to them, I realised it was coloured both by these and the games I grew up with. This may be a bit of a late moment to reach backward and throw in an entirely new comparison, but take Bullfrog's Theme Park against Smooth, Chris Sawyer's Roller Coaster Tycoon. It's not uncommon to find people whose fond memories are of this latter game because it was the only one they played. It is also not uncommon to find people who played both and found the more involved ride design, the more detailed landscape, the streamlined management, and the more modern universe user interface, well done reading, makes this latter one their choice. And I should know, I'm one of them, hence why I'm holding up this CD and not a theme park box. But you will also find people who say theme park is for them the better game. Put that back on the shelf. Also smooth. You know, it was the first theme park game. It's got more of a wry sense of humour. It's the one where you actually can put salt in the fries to sell more drinks. You know, there's more behind the scenes management with shop inventory and union negotiations. And for Mini, even the basic styles, you know, are more appealing. It's cartoony, it's fun. It feels more of a game than the more realistic and somewhat dry isometric world of Roller Coaster Tycoon. No, I'm not one of those people, because I grew up with PC games in the era where we went from the 286 to the 486 to the Pentium class machines in short succession. The era where the PC was still competing with other home computers, and it felt like every year brought an explosion in the complexity and depth which was possible. For me, I like Roller Coaster Tycoon because I want to spend ages tweaking track layouts and placing scenery around flat rides, knowing all the complex rules for how it makes a difference. I want my rides physically simulated and my guests having individual preferences about which of them to go on, which also change depending on their current mood. I want a game which forces me to make decisions down to the layout of an individual hedge maze, because if I get it wrong, those guests are going to be trapped in there forever. Yeah, Chris Sawyer games and pathfinding, there's a theme there. I want a game which requires those sociopathic levels of code optimization to the point nobody else can even work with the code base, because it needs all of this to make the complexity work, even with all the relative power of a Pentium 90, a machine which makes Theme Park run so fast, it's unplayable. Oh sure, Transport Tycoon Deluxe maybe bounce off it initially, with its own rendition of having so many options you just don't know where to start. But to me, that depth is what makes it great. Maybe some do prefer the simplicity and the point-to-point routes of OG Transport Tycoon, and that's a valid opinion. You know, if you say it feels more like a game and Deluxe feels more like a railroad network simulator, then that's a valid way to come out of that. But the joy for me is staying up until 2 AM tweaking signals. And in 30 years, that has been a lot of 2 AMs. As some sort of closing statement, yeah, you know, if you've not been watching the progress bar along the bottom, this is the point at which you're free to wander off without guilt. Favourites are a strange sort of idea once you start getting, well, probably too old to be making videos for the internet if we're honest. They don't burn with the intensity they do in your youth. You know, the way that when you're 16, smooth, again, you know, the way that your favourite record can change 3 times in a single week. Is it this? Is it this? No, it's this. And you have this really strong conviction that no, this is the finest thing you've ever heard. You know, favourites as you age are more constants. They're the boxes that you kept even as you moved between rental properties with no storage. The music you return to after years and it feels like you heard it only yesterday. I mean, yes, definitely the case for all 3 of these. Films that you've seen so many times. You can anticipate every minor plot detail and yet you realise you haven't watched them in years. And likewise, in the case of TTD, there is the question of, am I really even playing it anymore? You know, when I open up JGRPP and play an enormous map with trains that do things that graphics engine was never designed to do, and whose fault is that? Is it notionally the same game? Or is it something different that just happens to share a lot of the mechanics and is able to load the same tile sets? But in some way that is also what I'm getting at there. It might not be the same game, or it might be, but playing an open source recreation, it's still tracing a line back through all those times Transport Tycoon was the first game I installed on a new computer. All those times I dug out my original CD so I could have the correct graphics and scenarios in OpenTTD. You think I'd have saved them somewhere the first time. All those hours working out the ideal combination of TTD patch flags, even the years before all of that, where I just played the game as it was in that 30-year-old box before it was 30 years old, for many, many hours. And all of that owes itself on some level to me over the Christmas holiday in 1995, discovering Megarail 1960 and going, oh yeah, those signals, that's why they go weird if you click on them twice. Gosh, that's a lot of fun, isn't it? I think we're over. Should we go Should we go play this? That'd be quite fun, wouldn't it?